Hi, welcome to East Meets West, a conversation on Japanese culture in British architecture. I am Clarinda Kama from the Polish Embassy in London, and I am joined by Neil Jackson. Welcome, Neil.
Hello, thank you for having me.
Neil is an architect and architectural historian. He is the author of a recent book, Japan and the West, an architectural dialogue. Thank you, Neil, once again for joining us today, and welcome to you all who are tuned in to this conversation which the Polish Embassy is organizing with Open House London. Perhaps I should start by explaining why the choice of topic. We are currently doing some research on the history of this building, and I have to say that this particular room, the Japanese drawing room, has always been very intriguing because of its unique Japanesque interiors. Now, the Polish Foreign Ministry purchased this building from Lady Lucy Markham, the widow of Sir Arthur Basil Markham, MP, in 1921. Now, the Markhams were wealthy coal mine owners, and they were also avid art collectors. And it was in this very room where they amassed a collection of artworks. So we have always made this assumption that it was during their occupancy that the interiors were refurbished in today's Japanesque style or Japonisme. So turning to you, Neil, now, do you think that is a correct assumption that the 1910s would be the years when this room was actually refurbished?
I think that's highly probable. The house where you are now is a house by Robert Adam, the Scottish architect who built a great number of houses in the late 18th century. And it's wholly conceivable that this interior was part of the Markham's redecoration of the interior of the building, which was carried out between about 1912 and 1914. The reason that seems likely is that in 1910, there was a major exhibition at White City in West London called the Japan-British Exhibition. And there were erected there a lot of Japanese buildings, and this caused a great deal of public interest. And I'm sure the Markhams might have gone there and seen this exhibition and thus got inspired to turn one of their rooms into something that is recognizably Japanese. Having said that, the fashion for Japanese interiors actually went back about 30 previous years to around 1870. And there are houses in London, or there were houses in London, they're mostly gone now, such as number 1 Holland Park, where a British architect called Thomas Jekyll built in a very large Japanese interior for the Greek merchant and businessman Aleko Ionides. There's also a house which still exists just next to John Lewis's Peter Jones department store on Sloane Square, which had a whole Japanese interior created in Japan and shipped over and erected there for the owner, the artist Mortimer Mempes. That interior has sadly gone as well. So there were examples prior to the 1910 exhibition at White City of quite extensive, quite magnificent Japanese interiors being created. But I would guess this one that you have is really dating from that second decade or so of the 20th century.
So by that time, obviously, Japonisme was already a well-established style. Let me just describe the ceiling to you and to those who are joining us, because it really is quite a feat. It's quite an interesting artwork. So our ceiling is actually painted in Japanese gold lacquer, and you will see that the cornices, if you just take a closer look at your screen, you will see that the cornices are painted in red. Now, throughout the ceiling, we have parallel beams, and in the junctions of those beams, we have very intricate metalwork, which feature something which looks like Japanese coats of arms. Neil, are these elements that are familiar to you and do you think are representative of this Japonisme or Anglo-Japanese style?
Yes, what you are referring to, the coats of arms or heraldic devices, are what are known as mon, M-O-N, is how we would write it, the Japanese word. And these represent the various families in the same way as coats of arms or heraldic devices represent families in this country. And the common form is a circle with a flower or maybe a bird or something like that within it. And these are repeated quite often in Japanese prints, woodblock prints, and in their buildings and so on. So to take a simple device like that and use it in Western architecture was not a difficult thing to do. And on the ceiling above you there, the mon have got mulberry leaves in them, which is the device of the Tokugawa shogunate, which is a sort of interesting thing to do because the shoguns were deposed in 1868 and the imperial family was reinstated at that time in Japan. So it seems funny to me that the device, if we are reading it correctly, is that of the deposed government, not of the current Japanese government at this time. The British architects who liked the mon and used it extensively in their work were people like Richard Norman Shaw and William Eden Nesfield, and they were working in the 1870s and 80s. Well, they worked later too, but in those years they were using the mon quite extensively. And this is probably because of the 1878 Paris exhibition, where there were these Japanese buildings. Actually, I should say the 1867 and the 1878 exhibitions. And the British tourists, British architects went over there and saw these things firsthand and came back and adopted them into their work, but mostly in plasterwork and not in metalwork as you have in your ceiling there.
I mean, you mentioned the Victorian architects, right? Jekyll, McMurdo, and Nesfield. And I was wondering, given the limitations to travel, I mean, I don't imagine they were able to travel to Japan. Where were these architects drawing their inspiration from? Was it really mainly from these international exhibitions?
Yes, the international exhibitions were enormously significant, and there were a great number of them. London in 1862 was really just an exhibition of Japanese artifacts. But Paris 1867, buildings were erected in the Japanese style, and that continued in Vienna in 1873, and buildings from Vienna were brought over to London and re-erected in Alexandra Park. There was the Centennial Exhibition in Philadelphia in the United States in 1876, another one in Paris in 1878. In 1885 in London, this is a long list. In 1885 in London, there was a Japanese village that was erected inside a very large exhibition hall in Knightsbridge. And that burnt down, which is not surprising because Japanese interiors or Japanese buildings frequently burned, and it was re-erected. So there was this constant display of three-dimensional Japanese architecture, i.e. real buildings. And that, of course, caused a great deal of interest, much more so, I think, than just the prints and the drawings, of which there were a huge number, particularly woodblock prints, a huge number of those available on the Western market.
So Japan, really took Europe in a storm. I mean, it was everywhere, as you were saying. But I was wondering, have you, in your field work and archival work, Neil, have you encountered anything similar to the ceiling that is here in the embassy, the one here in Portland Place? I mean, I'm talking about ceilings that we can find today. I mean, the ones you have mentioned so far seem to have been destroyed.
Yeah.
So what has your research shown you?
Well, I haven't discovered any ceilings similar to this one. That's not to say that there aren't any, but I certainly haven't found any. Japanese ceilings traditionally were flat, and the ceiling you have has got a coved or a rounded edge to it all the way around. Where the wall joins the ceiling, there's a curve in there, and this could be there for a number of reasons. It might be, and I think it's rather unlikely, that it's been built like that to hide or to cover up the existing decorated cornice of the Robert Adam building. I think likely the cornice have been chipped away altogether. It could be that the room originally had a coved ceiling like that. The Palladian ceiling, such as Robert Adam did, sometimes had that coving, but this ceiling here with the beams and the gold lacquered panels in between gives me the impression of something that is, in a sense, inserted within the framework of the building, within the four walls. I shouldn't say the framework, within the walls, and it has this Japanese notion of being temporary, that it could be removed. In the same way, the walls in Japanese houses are temporary. They're never permanent. You can slide them along, you can take them away. And this interior as a decorated space within a masonry structure has perhaps some of that quality.
But I mean, just going back, I mean, do you think the British audience were consciously applying, these elements into their interiors? I mean, for example, the Mon, for example. I mean, you mentioned earlier, did that mean anything to the British audience, or the sense of temporary solutions which coving structures provided? Was that something that architects or interior designers here were aware of, or were they sort of just cherry picking elements of Japanese aesthetics and incorporating them into their work?
Well, I'm sure a great deal of it was cherry picking, as you say, but the Mon, sometimes Western painters used a decorative device like that. The American artist James McNeill Whistler was a great Japanophile, and he used a signature which was a butterfly. That was his Mon, and he would put this in his paintings. And in the same way as you might use a Japanese Mon to sign your work. The other part of your question, the insertion of Japanese interiors into buildings, I think most of this was done for aesthetic effect. Yet your question brings to mind the library at the Glasgow School of Art by Charles Rennie Mackintosh, which of course has been burnt twice in the last 10 years and I suppose is going to be recreated. But what we actually have there at the Glasgow School of Art is a situation not dissimilar to where you are, in as much as here's a masonry building and a lightweight timber interior is inserted within it as a three-dimensional space. And Robert Adam is from Scotland. I'm not really trying to make a Scottish connection, but in Scottish castles, or tower houses we call them, the interiors were often built within the four heavy masonry walls. And those interiors, in a sense, were another piece of architecture within the greater mass of the building. And I think that's very much one way of reading or understanding the Glasgow School of Art library, and possibly a way of understanding your particular building.
I mean, you earlier spoke about Japanese pavilions and villages or houses that were actually installed, recreated in these international exhibitions, and artifacts, Japanese artifacts. What happened to them after these exhibitions? I mean, I remember reading that there were shops here not too far from today's Portland Place in Regent Street where they had, they actually sold some of these Japanese objects. So it made it more available to a wider public. So what happened to them, to these objects?
There was a huge market for Japanese artifacts. Crates and crates of this stuff was imported from Japan, often of not very good quality, and sold to the collectors and to the public in the West, who were just dying for that fashion. Japonisme, it was terribly fashionable. After the big exhibitions, the buildings, I think, were probably on the whole just dismantled and dispensed with, although some, I'm sure, would have been bought and located in people's private estates or their back gardens if the gardens were big enough. The one that was in the Viennese exhibition of 1873, as I say, got rebuilt at Alexandra Palace. Well, there were about 3 pavilions there, got rebuilt at Alexandra Palace. The Japanese pavilion, a very large building at the Philadelphia Exposition of 1876, was similarly relocated. But I think on the whole, they probably were dismantled in the same way as exhibition buildings usually are.
Yeah. Let's just go back to this room, because you see, this room is quite big. It's quite generous. So I'd imagine that it was originally built precisely to have guests, host parties, or even to keep a large number of objects and artifacts for collectors. What do you think was the reason why certain interiors or certain spaces were made into the Japonisme style? What was the reason behind these architectural decisions?
Well, in the same way as any room would be used to display one's good taste and one's wealth through a collection of paintings or hangings or whatever it is. So the decoration of a room was done precisely to display one's good taste and one's wealth. So this particular room that you have, which is an L-shaped room, might or might not have been two separate rooms earlier. Maybe it always was one L-shaped room, and it would have been a big reception room. I don't know the configuration of the house in particular, and I doubt that it would have been a dining room being L-shaped. It doesn't seem to be quite right. But the way it was used with this magnificent ceiling was clearly as a demonstration of wealth and taste. And one would invite one's guests up there and let them all marvel at the exquisite architecture.
Well, yes, as you were talking about, boasting wealth, I'm reminded of a prominent art critic and art collector from the Young Poland movement, what we know as the Moda Polska in Poland, and what's such his important figure when it comes to Japanese style in Poland is Felix Jasieński, and in fact there is a very important portrait of him. He is painted by Leon Wiczorkowski, where he is dressed in a Japanese kimono and shows a man who is very confident and self-assured, but also, quite proud of his rather exotic taste for Japan and the East. So going from spaces, I was wondering if we could slightly talk about the actual investors, the owners. Who were those who were actually commissioning these kinds of interiors? I mean, obviously you had to be wealthy, had a taste for the exotic. What has your research shown you, Neil?
Well, I think you've summed it up very well. You really have to be quite wealthy, and a taste for the exotic is very much behind it all. The painter Mortimer Mempes, who owned the house, which I mentioned earlier, near the Peter Jones department store, 29 Cadogan Gardens, the house that was built by Arthur Haygate McMurdo, but had an interior had an interior created in Japan and by Japanese craftsmen and shipped over. This man, Mortimer Mempes, as a painter, was an acolyte of James McNeill Whistler until he fell out with Whistler, as anybody seemed to do eventually. But he went to Japan and he sourced the craftsman, found the craftsman to make this interior, and had the whole thing shipped back. And it was a work of art in itself and terribly delicate. And it's not just one room, it was essentially the whole of the interior of the building, maybe not the servant spaces, but the public spaces and private spaces. So, one had to have this passion, I think. But Japonisme was, although it was something that the wealthy certainly indulged in, it was also something that nearly everybody could indulge in, because one could buy Japanese woodblock prints, and they were easily available, as I've suggested earlier. And the Japanese lacquered bowls, such as you mentioned, or the lacquer work you mentioned, the Japanese lacquer bowls use the colors that you have in your room there, the red and the black and the gold. And this is actually very typical. The the Japanese bowls would have red or black lacquer on the outside and gold on the inside. And much of this was really because, well, the choice of gold on the inside was really because the Japanese houses being so gloomy on the inside due to lack of lighting. They used gold as a way of picking up light and reflecting, so one could, see where the bowl was, see where to pour your sake or whatever it is. So these colours, the lacquerwork colours, which you have in the ceiling, really can be sourced right back to that sort of artifact. Very Japanese, but also very much the sort of thing that you could buy in the shops in Regent Street, as you said.
Yes, interesting. Now taking on this conversation, to today's aesthetic tastes and architectural work. As you beautifully put it in your book, it's Japan and the West, an architectural dialogue. Can we just briefly talk about how this conversation or dialogue has moved onwards into our contemporary world? In Poland, for example, an obvious example is the Manga Museum, built in 1994 by Arata Isozaki in cooperation and collaboration with leading Polish architects, Krzysztof Ingarden and his associates. So today you can see that architects and artists are boldly incorporating elements of Japanese design, but also collaborating with each other dynamically, learning from each other's creativity. How do you find Japonisme today?
I would say Japonisme today is probably best understood through what we call minimalism, and the idea of the reduction of form, of architectural form, to something that is so minimal that, in a sense, you can't take anything else away from it. The Japanese architect you mentioned, Arata Isozaki, was enormously impressed with the work of Charles Rennie Mackintosh, who I mentioned earlier in the Glasgow School of Art, and he said that Mackintosh had an innate understanding of Japanese art or architecture, although Mackintosh had never been to Japan. And his work, Mackintosh's work, has, even in the late 19th century, a sense of minimalism. It is extremely reduced when compared with the richness of decoration that was found in other houses at the time. So when we look at minimalism today, how we might see it in modern architecture, it's a sort of reduction of modern architecture, that's modern with a capital M, where I suppose one could call it the machine aesthetic of modern architecture has been taken out, and the architecture is reduced to a simple series of planes or surfaces that appear to float. And this, I would relate back again to the sort of interior where you are, where the wall panels seem to almost float within the space, the greater space of that volume, in the way that I've tried to describe it already.
Fascinating, really. Thank you very much. It's interesting to see, how Japonisme, and what initially started as something like an exotic fascination has revolved and evolved into something more dynamic, more rich. Sadly, we'll have to bring this conversation to a close. Thank you very much, Neil. It was fascinating and really such a learning experience to have spoken to you today. Thank you for your time. Thank you for all of you. Thank you to all of you who are joining in this conversation. Please allow me to invite you to our other events. Please check out the Polish Embassy film, which is part of the Open House feature films. Please do join us for the online piano concert, where Polish pianist Tomasz Lis performs the music of Frédéric Chopin and Ignacy Jan Paderewski. You might also want to check out our outdoor exhibit just outside the embassy on the Polish airmen and their contribution in the Battle of Britain. So, Neil, thank you so very much once again. Thank you everyone for joining us, and please have a good day. Goodbye.
Thank you. Goodbye.